Disappearing leaves. Fall had always been a magical time in the quiet suburban town of Oak Ridge. The streets were lined with towering maple trees that exploded with vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows each autumn. Families would take weekend walks, admiring the kaleidoscope of colors, children jumping into piles of crunchy leaves, and neighbors sharing warm mugs of cider over wooden fences. It was the kind of town that came alive with the season, a postcard-perfect place where everything seemed to follow the same predictable, comforting rhythm. But this year, something was wrong. It began subtly, so small that most people didn't even notice at first. The leaves, once so vibrant and full of life, were disappearing, not wilting or rotting as one would expect, but simply vanishing. One day, a tree would be aflame with color, and the next morning it would be barren, as if fall had never touched it. The first to notice were the elderly Petersons, who lived at the edge of town. Mrs. Peterson had been gazing out her kitchen window, sipping her tea, when she realized something odd. The massive oak tree in her yard, which had just begun to turn the deepest shade of red the day before, was now completely bare. She called her husband over, but Mr. Peterson shrugged it off. "Wind must have blown them away," he muttered, not one to dwell on strange occurrences. But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that had begun to creep over the neighborhood in the following days. More trees began to lose their leaves overnight. One by one, the streets that had once been bathed in autumn colors now looked bleak and lifeless. People began to talk. At first, it was dismissed as some strange natural phenomenon, perhaps an early frost or an odd weather pattern. But the weather remained mild, and the trees continued to stand tall, their limbs naked and eerie against the gray sky. It was the Carmichael family who uncovered the darker truth. They lived in an old house nestled between the woods and the main street, a house that had been in their family for generations. Jack Carmichael, the father, was a man who liked to figure things out. He wasn't one to be easily rattled, but as the leaves continued to vanish, his curiosity got the better of him. One night, after putting his 2 young children to bed, Jack decided to set up a camera by the largest tree in their yard, a massive maple that had been there since his grandfather's time. The tree was still full of leaves, but something told Jack that it wouldn't stay that way for long. He placed the camera in such a way that it would capture anything or anyone who might be disturbing the trees. The following morning, the maple was stripped bare. Jack retrieved the camera, his heart racing as he scrolled through the footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. At exactly 3 a.m., a faint rustling began. The camera picked up the sound of whispering, though the words were indecipherable. Then, slowly, the leaves began to fall, not drift to the ground as they normally would, but rise into the air as if being pulled away by invisible hands. One by one, they vanished into the night, leaving the trees stark and barren. Jack replayed the footage several times, trying to make sense of it. There were no animals, no wind, no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused it. The leaves simply disappeared. That evening, he told his wife, Emily, what he had seen. She listened, her face pale and tight with worry. "We need to leave, Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong here. It's not just the trees." Jack wanted to argue, tell her that they were safe, that it was all just some strange, explainable occurrence. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. There was something malevolent in the air, something unnatural. The next night, Jack decided to stay up and watch the trees himself. He sat by the window, his eyes glued to the maple. Midnight came and went. At 2 a.m., the wind picked up, and the whispering began again, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from outside, it was in the house. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the sound, heart hammering in his chest. The whispers seemed to come from the very walls, swirling around him in a chaotic, disjointed chorus. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and suddenly, the leaves on the ground outside began to move, as if alive. They lifted into the air, twisting and spinning in a whirlwind of color before disappearing into the night sky, just like on the footage. And then the voices grew louder. "They're feeding," a voice whispered, sending a shiver down Jack's spine. "They're always hungry." Jack stumbled back from the window, knocking over a chair in his panic. His breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the truth. The leaves weren't just vanishing, they were being taken. Something was feeding on them. The next day, Jack did what he should have done from the beginning. He went to the town archives, searching for any record of strange occurrences in Oak Ridge's history. What he found left him cold. Decades ago, in the late 1800s, the land where Oak Ridge now stood was once home to a settlement known as Wynwood. The settlers had built their homes around a dense forest, just like Oak Ridge, and they had prospered for years. But then, one fall, the leaves began to disappear. At first, the settlers dismissed it as a minor oddity, just like the residents of Oak Ridge had done. But soon, people began to vanish as well, children at first, then adults. They would disappear in the dead of night, leaving no trace but the sound of rustling leaves. The town grew desperate, sending search parties into the forest, but none returned. Wynwood was eventually abandoned, left to rot as the trees reclaimed the land. Jack felt sick. The same thing was happening again. The leaves were just the beginning. Soon, people would start to disappear. That night, Jack and Emily didn't sleep. They stayed up, watching the trees, waiting for the whispers. At exactly 3 a.m. they came. They're feeding, the voices hissed, filling the room with a cold, unnatural wind. You've disturbed them. Jack grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the door. We're leaving, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. We need to get out of here. But as they reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The wind inside the house grew stronger, howling through the walls as the leaves outside began to swirl once more. They won't let us leave, Emily cried, her eyes wide with terror. We're trapped. Jack pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were all Jack could hear. The air was thick with the sound of rustling leaves spinning in a frenzy around the house as if alive. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wind stopped. The leaves fell silent. Jack and Emily stood frozen, waiting for anything to happen. But nothing did. The house was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, from the basement, came a single, unmistakable sound. The slow, deliberate creak of a door opening. Jack's heart sank. He didn't need to see what was down there. He knew. The leaves weren't feeding on the trees anymore. They were feeding on them. The following morning, the Carmichael house stood silent, the front door slightly ajar. The town went about its business, unaware that another family had vanished, leaving nothing behind but a few scattered leaves on the floor. As the days passed, more people began to disappear. The trees remained bare, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the town grew eerily quiet. Oak Ridge had become a ghost town, just like Wynwood before it, and still, the leaves continued to vanish, night after night, as the cursed trees fed on the life force of those foolish enough to stay. In the end, Oak Ridge was abandoned, just like Wynwood. The trees reclaimed the land, and the whispers continued, carried on the wind for anyone brave or foolish enough to listen. They're always hungry, the voices said, and they will always feed.